Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and also thank you very much for the invitation to this conference. It did come as a bit of a surprise to me that I will participate, because the nominally selected or invited Rüdiger Lenz, who's the executive director of the Aspen Institute, due to unforeseen consequences, unfortunately could not participate. So it's a double honor to be a sort of a substitute for him, and I do hope I live up to this honor. Second introductory remark, it has already been mentioned. I do not have a very long legacy in observing German-Israeli or German defense relations, but having been born in 1983, I have been politicized in a post-Cold War world, and I think this is actually quite important when looking at the topic, which is the development of Germany's defense and European policy post-unification. I do not think, however, that we can start this topic without looking before 89, and Professor Spiro this morning already mentioned the time the German Bundeswehr was founded. So when we're looking at German defense policy today, we are looking at the fourth generation of Bundeswehr officers. For example, my grandfather joined the German Bundeswehr relatively early, in June 1952. He left the services in 1974, which should roughly be around the time General Wittmann joined the services. So we only have four generations. Pardon?
I only look so old.
So we have relatively little experience in defense policy under the auspices of the German Bundeswehr. We furthermore look at a third generation of the so-called peace movement, which I believe is also very important when we look at how the German defense policy or posture has developed since 1989. And then, even when looking at the development of German defense policy post-89, we still have to keep in mind that there are certain elements of the German Bundeswehr or defense policy which have not been changed and most likely won't be changed because we have constitutional elements which very strongly guide our defense policy. One example is the doctrine of inner leadership and the never alone posture. Oh, sorry. Yeah, also you can tell that I've never been with the military. I don't speak very loud. Now, the scope and objective of my presentation is... okay. The scope and objective...
You still write notes.
The scope and objective of my presentation is to provide an overview of the developments of Germany's defense policy, not Germany's foreign policy. It is to identify changes in the environment German defense policy operates in. It is an open question in this presentation to ask whether the German defense policy has changed in essence in order to adapt to observable changes. It is not to specifically address the European policy of Germany or German policy in the European Union regarding defense policy, because number one, or A, it is in our constitutional premises that we have a multilateral view towards defense. And secondly, and most importantly, it is mostly negligible, which also is probably telling a story. I will furthermore not examine any event in detail, but rather provide an overview in order to identify general notions in Germany's defense policy. And I will also not provide a cure or recommendations of how I believe things could be done better, but I do hope to inspire a sort of debate with you who have been dealing with the difficult challenge of planning under ambiguity and planning with weak signals and still develop a very successful defense posture. So in 1990, the German Institute for International Affairs and Security Policy, SWP, has been charged by the German ministry to identify the broad, foreseeable framework German defense policy will be operating in. And Professor Krause, as far as I know, has been very active and instrumental in providing this study. So regarding the situation, it was assessed that there is an absence of strategic conflict because there is no strategic enemy anymore. and that Germany is set in or part of a zone of peace, and it secondly is now firmly embedded in a transatlantic West European and European cooperative structure. It was thirdly noted that there are still some conflicts, but they are not of a strategic nature. They are regional, or they are political, i.e. Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi as being dictators and strongmen. Now, what was derived out of this was a continuation of never alone, but also a sort of negative perception of ad hoc coalitions dealing with defense and security issues, but any action, any development had to be done within the existing multilateral frameworks Germany was in. The priorities derived out of this was to keep the international cooperative order, to expand the cooperative international order, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, and to a lesser extent in the Near and Middle East. Thirdly, it was the inclusion of Russia, so it doesn't become a strategic enemy again. And lastly, it was, in fact, in light of the regional conflict challenges and the dictators and the regime change attitude, it was to develop an international toolbox for conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and post-conflict stabilization. Now, taking this into account, we need to ask, does this stand the reality check? Do we see that this has actually happened, and has the German defense policy developed accordingly? I would argue yes, but largely no. And then we come back to the element of surprise, I would argue. Now, in the early 90s, the most important task was to integrate the Eastern Germany into the defense policy, or into the defense posture of Germany, which was a large and very consuming task. It was also about having less forces, because the challenges we observed were considered as being not of a strategic nature anymore. And we lived through, and maybe continue to live through, a sort of multilateral peace euphoria. That was already highly questioned in the beginning of the 90s and in the mid-90s. It was certainly very visible in 1994 when genocide happened again, and we all remember the terrible pictures we've seen in Rwanda. We then had, in 1999, we had probably the most important change of German defense policy since 1989, with the Kosovo Intervention, where German soldiers were first actively involved in a battle. And it also led to a ruling of the German Constitutional Court, which has had a lot of impact on the German defense posture. And that also leads, or can be traced back to what I said at the beginning, that there is a very strong constitutional or legal element to the development of German defense policy. We then had a time of heightened European Union engagement, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where Germany perceived itself as a sort of a last Messiah, but it was not really a prolonged engagement. It was not a very deep engagement. You might remember the Congo intervention, which was not really an intervention, but more an armed observation of the elections there. There was also some debate with France regarding an intervention in Chad and the Central African Republic. However, the tenet of any of these activities was not so much the military, it was mainly good governance and the police. We then, in 2006, with all the, I forgot to mention Afghanistan, very sorry, very, very important. 2001, of course, Germany and the global war on terror. It was a bit torn between the transatlantic alliances, and the transatlantic alliance was strengthened by contributing to the ISAF mandate in Afghanistan, but at the same time there again was a sort of military reluctance in that contribution. Again, here we have a strong focus on police work and good governance work, but not so much on military tasks. The experiences in Afghanistan the impression of the Twin Towers falling in New York led to the drafting of a new white book in 2006 and the development of something sounding almost revolutionary for German terms, the concept of German network security, which is nothing else than Germany said we cannot separate security into individual ministries or responsibilities within those ministries, but we have to take a holistic or comprehensive approach to deal with our security challenges. Whether this has lived up to the words, again, it is up for discussion. I'll attach it later on. We then had we tried to implement this new concept of network security, and we got a new Minister of Defense whose name was Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg, who was an astute student and is probably better known for faking his PhD thesis than for his reforms. However, he wanted to create the mother of reforms for the German Bundeswehr, what could have been perceived and was perceived by some as a beginning of actual and fundamental change. What is left of the reform is that Germany has no conscription army anymore, but a professional army, which in and of itself is providing challenges of its own. We then had the Arab Spring and the Libya intervention. We supported what we perceived as democratic callings from the Arab world, did not see that democracy was one of the few signs that was hardly seen, but it was mostly about economic participation. But we did abstain from the Libya intervention. So nothing has changed much. Then the credit crunch, Greece, and Germany's, or the realization that Germany is is the strongest country within the European Union, but remains, to quote The Economist, remains a reluctant hegemon. Since then, a debate on the new responsibility or the responsibility of Germany in the wider world is looming, and there is many suggestions, but there is no real change to be seen. We then have, in that sort of reluctant hegemon situation, we have Russia's unlawful annexation of Crimea as a consequence of the EU expansion talks with Ukraine. And oops, they did it again. We were caught by surprise. It was not necessarily foreseen in the study of 1990 that such surprise could happen, that a strategic conflict could ever develop again. And to find yet another surprise and to end that third part of my presentation, we have mass migration, we have a renewed phase of terrorism within Europe, and we are drafting a new white book. So maybe this white book is a way out of the trap. However, I believe it won't be, and I'll tell you why in a second. As you grasped probably, my thesis is that since the study of how German defense policy, or the challenges of German defense policy in the foreseeable future, I do not think that any change, fundamental change, has actually occurred. It remained in that particular post-Cold World War scenario, and that has many reasons, some of them being because there is a public sentiment against the military or the use of the instrument military in a political context. But it has also other reasons, which are more within the security policy or defense policy arena. And I think I've got got a couple of points which I would like to make why I believe Germany is having such difficulties in adapting to a fundamentally changed environment. Number one is, and I will be done in 5 minutes, thank you. Number one is that we have a continuation of an unwillingness to accept power and the relativity of power in international relations in Germany. So we have an either-or stance. It is either legal or moral. There is no politics. Second, We have a lack of electoral interest. In an interview with a member of parliament, why Germany is so slow in changing and adapting in defense policy, the member of parliament simply said, defense and security are not a sexy topic within Germany. So as long as it's not something which is discussed in a wider civil societal setting, it will continue to not change. Third, we have a lack of leadership, a lack of accountability, and a lack of coordination. And I think this is, especially the last part, is very, very detrimental to any change in German defense posture. We have, thirdly, a fixation on structures and hierarchies rather than tasks and challenges, which leads to a lack of flexibility, which is so important in a time where change and chaos, complexity, surprise are normalcy and not the exception. We fourthly have a lack of understanding of what we believe the term strategic means. Whereas during the Cold War it was very clear and simple, strategic equals nuclear. Today it's very difficult to define for us what actually means the term strategic and what kind of strategy do we develop against this backdrop. My fifth point is that we have a stigmatization of the military and a fixation on civilian solutions, which leads to a lack of professionalism, not only on the military side, but also on the civilian side, because it is almost as if they are walking in two streets divided by a wall, leading into not so clear directions. And we also have a lack of self-understanding within those wearing uniform of what their task is and how they should conduct their service professionally within the framework that is given by the Constitution. We also have limited human resources in defense and security. It is always very nice to travel abroad and engage in discussions on defense and security with young scholars, medium-aged scholars, elder scholars, practitioners, but it is very difficult to do the same in Germany. You will not find a very large variety. That leads, again, to a lack of professionalism, especially in the what I would call strategic communications. It is very difficult for the political world to communicate the necessity and the requirements of the defense and security policies in Germany. And this again alludes to the speaker before me. We are very, very limited in innovative approaches. My seventh point is that we devote limited financial resources into defense and security. Now that leads to a lack of strategic ability, a lack of technological and technical or tactical ability, and again, a lack of flexibility. We either do collective defense or we do out of area, but we cannot conceive or do both, which is a bit of a problem if you have to deal with both challenges simultaneously. And number 8, and this is a real inborn thing within Germany, we enjoy the blame game and we like to stay in the comfort zone. So there is a reluctance to change, both general and specific. General implies, oh, so much has changed already. Remember the Bundeswehr reform of Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg. Afghanistan, the Kosovo Intervention. So much has changed, but no one dares to ask, have we also changed? We changed already. Network security as a new doctrine, but is it on paper or is it actually implemented? And the multilateral burden sharing. Germany is engaged in so many missions and operations. So why should we change? So that's another problem. So by way of conclusion, I think we can observe by just looking at the time between 1989 and 2015, we have a lack of ability to adapt, and we have a lack of flexibility, which can be seen and observed basically since 1956. By and large, the German defense policy continues to navigate on site with the problem that you only can see as far as you can see. Again, we do not, as far as I know, do too many wildcard exercises or scenario planning. And the most important development in German defense policy since 1989 has been the end of conscription. And that's it. And in the face of migration and terrorism, which is what we're looking at now as the gravest challenge, I do not foresee much change within the German defense policy, but I foresee much change within the police and domestic security world, because both migration and terrorism are not regarded as a military challenge, but in a domestic security or criminal act challenge. Thank you very much.